The creek had come up so fast that Marguerite Coy, 21 years old, felt the ground give way beneath her before she understood. The water had already risen past her knees, and she was clawing at a slick clay bank in the dark with one hand, while the other kept a death grip on a canvas roll, holding her father's round knife and $11 folded into oilcloth, the current dragging at her skirts hard enough to pull her boots clean off if she let it. And somewhere above her on the bank, closer now than he had been an hour before, a man's voice called her name in a tone that had long since stopped pretending to be kind. She had left the boarding house in Wolf Creek before first light, specifically to be gone before he woke, and she had nearly made it, 3 miles up along the swollen creek, with the storm that had been building over the ridge for 2 days, finally breaking loose behind her, turning a crossing she had forded easily the evening before, into a brown, roaring flood that had very nearly taken her under twice already. She hauled herself up the bank on hands that had gone numb, mud to her elbows, and ran. Because running was the only answer left to a night that had already tried twice to kill her, first by water, and now by a man who had decided, over one too many drinks at the boarding house table, that a woman traveling alone, with even $11 to her name, was fair claim for the taking. She had no way of knowing. Stumbling half-blind through driving rain toward a black shape she could barely make out against the churning sky, that the shape was a barn, and that inside it, a woman who had died alone on that ground 20 years before had left behind exactly what a person in Marguerite's position would one day need. Settle in with us tonight, and before we go any further, tap that subscribe button and tell us down in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because what Marguerite Coy carried through that storm was about to become the finest saddlery in the territory. And the story of how she got there starts a long time before the flood, and a long way from where it ends. Wolf Creek sat where 2 forks of fast mountain water came together above a wide, dry grass valley. And it had grown up, as such towns did, around the trades a horse country needed most: a smithy, a livery. And, since the year Marguerite's father Ezra Coy first walked into the valley with a set of leather-working tools wrapped in a wagon sheet, a saddlery that within a decade had become known through 3 counties for the quality of its stitching and the honesty of its prices. Ezra Coy had a wife, Louisa, who died, bringing Marguerite into the world, and he raised his daughter alone in the small rooms above the shop, teaching her, almost from the time she could hold a tool at all, the trade that had kept the roof over both their heads. He taught her to skive a piece of harness leather thin and even along its edge, without ever letting the blade skip. He taught her to cut a saddle skirt from a hide with an eye that wasted almost nothing, reading the grain of the leather the way another craftsman might read the grain of wood. He taught her to wax thread by hand and to stitch a seam with an awl and 2 needles working in opposite directions, pulling each stitch snug but never so tight it puckered the leather, because a saddle stitched wrong would fail a rider at the worst possible moment, and a saddler's name, once attached to a piece of work, followed that work for as long as it held together. He taught her to fit a saddle to a horse's own back rather than to any fixed pattern, running her palm along a horse's withers and spine the way a doctor might read a patient. And he taught her, above everything else, to finish every piece of work as though her own name alone would answer for it. Because in a trade built on trust, a woman's mark on a piece of leather was worth exactly as much as the last thing she had put her name to. Ezra Coy had one living relation, a younger brother named Cornelius Coy, who had left Wolf Creek as a young man to try his luck at freighting, and had come back 12 years later, having failed at freighting and at 2 other ventures besides, with very little to show for any of it beyond a taste for other men's easier fortunes. Ezra, who had never learned to hold a grudge against his own blood, no matter how little that blood had earned it, took Cornelius in for a season, gave him work sweeping the shop and running errands, and eventually, wanting to see his brother settled, drew up a simple will, leaving the saddlery and its stock outright to Marguerite, his only child, with a modest cash bequest to Cornelius to help him start fresh elsewhere. He had the will witnessed, as was proper, by two men, but in the plain, unsuspicious way of a man who trusted his own family more than he trusted lawyers, he let Cornelius himself stand as the second witness, not understanding, or not troubling to ask, that a witness with a stake in the outcome of a will could, under the territory's law, void his own signature and, with it, the whole instrument, if the matter were ever pressed. Ezra Coy's cough began in the winter. Marguerite was 20. The same slow tightening that had taken so many men in that valley, who had spent a lifetime breathing tannin dust and wood smoke both. And he worked less, and sat longer by the cutting bench, and would sometimes hold a scrap of harness leather in his hands without working it at all, running his thumb along the grain, the way a man runs his thumb along the edge of a thing he is trying to memorize before it is taken from him. He did not speak of the will in those months, believing, as he had always believed, that the matter was settled and needed no further attention, and Marguerite, tending him and the shop both through a hard winter, had no reason to think otherwise. By the first frost of the following autumn, Ezra Coy was gone, buried on the low rise above the creek where the willows came in first each spring, and Marguerite sat alone in the shop with her father's tools laid out on the bench in front of her, and a stillness in her chest that she had learned from him and did not intend to break. The trouble came 3 weeks after the funeral, when Cornelius Coy, having consulted a lawyer of his own in the county seat, filed notice contesting the will on the plain and, as it turned out, entirely valid ground, that his own signature, as an interested party, rendered the document void under territorial law, leaving the estate to pass instead under the ordinary rules of intestacy, by which a surviving sibling stood equal in line with a surviving child. A circuit judge, presented with the law exactly as it stood, had little choice but to agree, and ordered the estate divided, the shop and its stock to be sold, and the proceeds split evenly between niece and uncle, unless one party could buy the other's share outright, which Marguerite, holding perhaps $30 total to her name, plainly could not do. Cornelius Coy did not come to hear the judgment read himself. He sent word instead, through a thin, correct young lawyer named Silas Meade, 28 years old, who explained to Marguerite afterward, on the courthouse steps, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man reading from a column of figures, that Mr. Coy took no particular satisfaction in the matter, that Mr. Coy had pressing debts from his failed ventures, and that Mr. Coy would allow her 30 days to remove her personal belongings before the shop and its equipment were sold at auction to satisfy both their shares. He did not ask what she intended to do. He did not ask where a woman of 21, with no other kin and no other trade, might go. He touched the brim of his hat, in the manner of a man who has done nothing wrong because every step he took was written down somewhere first, and rode back to the county seat. Marguerite spent the 30 days doing what needed doing, whether or not she had a home at the end of them. She finished the last 3 saddles already promised to waiting customers, because a promise made over a piece of leather was not a thing she intended to leave broken on principle. She sold what tools were not strictly her father's own, kept the rest, and gave a set of harness leather she could not carry to a farrier 2 doors down with a hard winter ahead of him, and on the morning of the 30th day she packed a canvas roll with her father's round knife, his best awl and needles, 2 changes of clothes, and $11 folded into oilcloth, which was the whole of the cash Ezra Coy had kept apart from the shop's working funds, and she walked out of the shop without looking back at the bench where she had learned, one careful stitch at a time, everything she understood about the world. She took a room above the mercantile in the small, clustered center of Wolf Creek, paying by the week for washing dishes at the Bell House, the town's one boarding house, and she listened, the way a person with nothing else to spend listens, because listening cost nothing at all. It was in the boarding house kitchen, wringing out a dish rag past 9 at night, that she heard old Zebulon Hart, 69 years old, the valley's unofficial historian and a man who remembered every claim and every death for 30 miles, speak of Bracken Hollow, a horse ranch and saddlery set up along the north fork of the creek by a widow named Adeline Sharp, who had kept the place alone for 21 years after her husband was killed breaking a green horse. Famous through 3 counties for the toughest, best-fitted work harness a freighter could buy, and who had been found dead in her own barn one spring morning by a boy sent up with the mail, gone quietly of some failure of the heart, and whose land had reverted to the county unclaimed since, because the ford above the ranch ran high and dangerous most of the year, and no one had thought a solitary old woman's saddlery worth the crossing. Marguerite asked where. Zebulon Hart, surprised that anyone still cared, told her, and drew the way on the back of a feed receipt with a stub of pencil, up along the north fork, past the old mill crossing to a bend, where the creek ran wide and shallow in an ordinary season, which was, he said, likely the very reason Adeline Sharp had chosen it, close enough to water for the stock and far enough from town for peace. He was not the only man in the kitchen listening. A boarder named Amasa Deal, 36 years old, who had been drinking steadily through supper, and steadily since, leaned across the table afterward and told Marguerite, in a voice pitched low but not low enough, that a whole abandoned horse ranch sitting unclaimed for 20 years was not the sort of prize a woman traveling alone ought to go chasing without a man along to see her safely through it, and that he would be glad, he said, to see her safely through quite a lot of things, if she would only be sensible about it. She did not answer him. She had learned, from an uncle who never once raised his voice, and a lawyer who never once met her eyes, exactly how little a woman's answer weighed against a man who had already decided what he meant to take. She thanked Zebulon Hart, said nothing more to Amasa Deal, and went up to her room and did not sleep. And in the black hour before the boarding house woke, she took her canvas roll, her father's knife, and her $11, and let herself out through the kitchen door into a night already heavy with the particular stillness that comes before a hard mountain storm breaks. She was perhaps 2 miles up the North Fork Trail, the sky over the ridge gone the color of a bruise, and the first fat drops of rain just beginning to fall, when she heard, behind her on the trail, boots moving too fast to be casual, and turned to see Amasa Deal closing the distance with the loose, deliberate walk of a man who believed the outcome of the matter was already settled in his favor. She did not wait to hear what he had come to say. She left the trail rather than answer him, cutting up along the creek bank where the brush grew thick enough to slow a man moving carelessly, and behind her his voice rose, no longer bothering with any pretense of courtesy, and the storm broke in full behind the ridge, rain coming down in sheets that turned the trail to running mud within minutes, and swelled the North Fork itself, already high from 2 days of upstream weather, into a brown, churning flood that tore at its own banks with a sound like something tearing cloth. She reached the ford above Bracken Hollow, believing, from the little Zebulon Hart had told her, that she was close, and she misjudged, in the dark and the driving rain, exactly how far the water had already risen, stepping off what she thought was a shallow crossing into a current that took her feet out from under her within 3 strides and dragged her a long, terrifying distance downstream before she managed to claw her way into an eddy behind a fallen cottonwood and haul herself, half drowned and shaking, up a slick clay bank on the far side. Amasa Deal's voice, calling her name now from somewhere back across the flooded ford, no longer sounded quite so certain of itself, the water between them having become, in the space of a few violent minutes, an obstacle Even a determined man might think twice about crossing in the dark, and Marguerite did not wait to find out whether he would try. She ran, mud to her elbows, boots sucking at the sodden ground, until the rain and her own ragged breath were the only sounds left in the world. And it was in that last exhausted half-mile, stumbling half-blind through the storm, that she saw, against the churning gray sky, the low black shape of a barn. The barn stood at the head of a wide, grassy bend in the creek, a long, low structure of squared timber, gone silver-gray with weather. Its wide double doors held fast by a length of chain looped through 2 iron rings and secured with a simple hasp gone thick with rust, and Marguerite, with no strength left to spend on patience and no tool at hand but her father's round knife, worked the rusted hasp loose by main force, wrenching it back and forth until the corroded metal gave way and the chain fell slack, and she dragged one heavy door open just far enough to slip through into a darkness that smelled of old leather, dry hay, and dust that had never been wet. And she pulled the door shut behind her against the storm and sank down against it, shaking, until her breath came back to her in the dark. When her eyes found their way in the faint gray light leaking through the barn's high, narrow windows, she saw the shape of the space around her. A long central aisle flanked by empty stalls, tack hooks along one wall still hung with a scatter of cracked and dust-furred harness, and at the far end, a proper saddler's workbench built along the north wall, its surface scarred deep with the marks of a round knife. Hundreds of small angled cuts worn pale into the wood by years of the same motion repeated in the same place. The unmistakable signature of a woman who had spent her solitary evenings at the one craft that had kept her whole. She did not sleep. Not right away. She found, in a battered tin on a shelf near the door, a stub of candle and a striker gone only slightly damp, and she coaxed a flame from it with hands that had only just stopped shaking, and she sat on an overturned feed bucket in its small, warm circle of light and let her heart beat slow while the storm worked itself out overhead. In the morning, with the rain thinned to a fine gray drizzle and the flood already beginning to drop along the creek below, Marguerite walked the length of the barn in the cold, clear light the way her father had taught her to walk any shop she meant to understand, and found, beyond the barn itself, a small adjoining tack room, a corral fence gone to leaning posts and sagging rail, and, further out along the bend, the collapsed remains of what had once been a modest house, roof fallen in years before, of no use to anyone now but the field mice. It was on the second morning, working loose a warped board at the base of the saddler's workbench where mice had chewed a nest, that she found the space beneath it was not simply dirt, but a shallow dug cavity lined with flat creek stones, the kind of careful, patient masonry a woman builds slowly, in the evenings, over more than one season. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth gone stiff and dark, was a tin document box, the hasp rusted but not seized, and inside the box, a canvas pouch heavy with coin, a folded packet of paper currency gone soft at the creases, and beneath both, a letter written in a plain, careful, unhurried hand that had clearly practiced its letters the same patient way it had practiced its stitching. The letter was dated the spring of 1870, and it began, "To whoever finds this ground worth keeping, my name is Adeline Sharp, and I have run this ranch and this saddlery alone for 21 years, since a green horse my husband was breaking, threw him against the corral fence, and broke his neck in the space of one bad afternoon, and I found, in the years after, that I had no wish to try my hand at loving anything again that could be taken from me so easily, saving only the work itself, which asks a person only for patience and a steady hand, and never once for a promise a body cannot keep. I was 29 years old when I buried him, and I have sold harness and tack to freighters in 3 counties every season since, and never once found a use for the money beyond what fed and clothed me. So it has gathered here, under this bench, a little at a time, against whatever day I judged I might need it, and never quite did. I am 50 years old as I write this, and my heart has begun to trouble me in a small, quiet way. I do not think will trouble me much longer, and I have no kin living that I know of, and I find I do not mind that half so much as I once thought I would. Whoever finds this box has found it because they crossed further than most people are willing to cross, and I have come to believe, working this bench alone for 21 years, that a trade worth keeping calls back the people patient enough to earn it. Take what is here. Keep the ranch if you have the temperament for it, and if you do not, at least be kind enough to let someone else try. I hope you are that someone, and I hope you are patient, and I hope somebody loves you well enough to notice when you have done a good day's work. Adeline Sharp. Written this 14th of April. Marguerite sat with the letter in her lap until the candle had burned low, and then she counted what the box held by its small light at the workbench, the way her father had taught her to count anything that mattered, twice and out loud, so the numbers would hold still. There were $212 in coin and paper, both. More cash money than Marguerite Coy had ever held at once in her life. More than her father's whole shop had turned in a good year. She did not spend $1 of it that first week. She set the box back beneath the bench, replaced the board, and began instead the only kind of work she trusted completely, which was the work of her own 2 hands. She spent that first fortnight simply looking, walking the barn and the corral and the ruined house, morning and evening, noting what could be saved and what could not, clearing the collapsed roof timbers from the old house foundation so the stone chimney at least stood clear, and rebuilding, board by board, the worst of the corral fence with lumber. She split herself from deadfall along the creek. She reset the barn's heavy doors on hinges she scavenged and cleaned from the ruined house, and she re-chinked the barn's worst gaps with clay dug from the creek bank below the bend. And she began, in the patient order Ezra Coy had drilled into her, since before she could properly hold a knife, to bring the saddlery back from the edge it had been standing on for 20 years. Word that a young woman was living alone at Bracken Hollow traveled the way word travels along a creek road, slowly at first, and then all at once, and by the end of her first month, Marguerite had visitors. Zebulon Hart himself rode up on a Sunday afternoon on a borrowed mule, 69 years old and proud of every mile, and stood in the barn a long while before he said that he had known Adeline Sharp slightly, in his younger years, and that she had once told him a piece of harness stitched right would outlast the horse that wore it, and the man who bought it both. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Amasa Deal had turned back from the flooded ford before the worst of the storm hit. No more sense in him drunk than sober, and had been thrown out of the Bell House within the week for failing to settle his bill, and had drifted on toward the railhead looking for freighting work, and had not troubled Wolf Creek since. He said it the way he said most things, as a plain fact of the valley's slow bookkeeping, and Marguerite found she did not need to hear anything more about the man than that. Obadiah Cruz, 41 years old, the Wolf Creek blacksmith, rode up with a set of forged hinges heavier and truer than the one she had scavenged, and reset the barn doors himself in an afternoon, refusing payment beyond a cup of coffee, saying only that Ezra Coy had mended his own harness for nothing the winter. A fire took half his forge, and the account had been open a long time. Verity Nash, 56, who kept the mercantile in Wolf Creek, sent up a bolt of waxed thread and a sack of tanning bark by way of a freighter, with a note in careful round writing that said only, "Your father sold my late husband his first good saddle, and never once overcharged an honest man." A widow named Constance Deal, no relation to Amasa, despite the shared name, 62 years old, who lived at the foot of the North Fork Trail and had buried a husband and a son on the same creek bank, began leaving a basket of fresh bread on the flat stone at the ford every second Sunday, never crossing herself, never asking to be thanked, simply leaving the basket and walking home. It was in the second spring, on a cool morning with the willows just beginning to leaf out along the creek, that Tobias Reed rode up the North Fork Trail on a rangy gray gelding trailing two unbroken yearlings on a lead line, a traveling horse trainer and farrier of 30 years who worked a circuit through the high valleys each season, gentling green stock and shoeing horses, too wild for a local smith to handle alone, and who had heard from Obadiah Cruz at the smithy 2 days before that a young woman was trying to bring back Adeline Sharp's old ranch alone. He came up expecting. He admitted to her plainly and without apology months later, to find a barn full of good intentions and very little else, and he found instead a woman fitting a work harness to a borrowed plow horse with a motion so calm and economical that he sat his gelding at the edge of the corral a full minute before she noticed him, simply watching the sureness of her hands along the horse's back. He did not offer to take over. That was the thing Marguerite noticed first and remembered longest, that Tobias Reed, unlike every other man who had crossed her path since her uncle's lawyer set a paper on a table between them, did not reach for the harness in her hands or suggest she might do better to let him finish the fitting. He asked instead how long she had worked leather, and when she told him her father's name, he said he had shod horses for freighters as far as 2 counties over, who spoke well of Coy saddles for as long as he had worked his circuit, and that he could see now where the steadiness had come from. He stayed that first visit 2 days, not because she asked him to, but because he had, he said, 2 yearlings on his lead line that would do better gentled on quiet ground before he tried to sell them on, and he worked them in the corral each morning while she worked leather at the bench, and on the second evening, before he rode on, he showed her a trick for softening a stiff piece of harness leather with warm neatsfoot oil, worked in slow circles rather than rubbed hard against the grain, a trick her father had never taught her, not because Ezra had not known it, she suspected, but because he had never needed it, and she practiced it that same evening under Tobias Reed's quiet correction until the motion settled into her hands on its own. He came back that autumn, when his circuit brought him north again for the fall shoeing season, and stayed 3 days helping her rebuild a proper set of stalls along the barn's south wall. And he came back the following spring with a fresh string of yearlings to gentle on her open ground, and by the second year, his spring and autumn visits to Bracken Hollow had become simply part of the shape of the season, the way the spring thaw and the first hard frost were part of the shape of the season, expected and depended upon, without either of them naming it as anything more than good sense between 2 people who understood the same patient, exacting craft. He never once suggested she could not manage the ranch alone. He never once offered to buy in, or take a share, or set his name beside hers on any paper. What he offered, each visit, was work, freely given and precisely matched to what the season needed. And Marguerite found, somewhere in the 3rd year, that she had begun listening for the sound of his gelding on the North Fork Trail the way she listened for the first true thaw, with a kind of patient, unhurried attention that she did not examine too closely, because examining it too closely felt, to her, like the sort of thing that could spoil a stitch before it had properly set. In her first autumn at Bracken Hollow, Marguerite walked down into Wolf Creek with $4 of Adeline Sharp's money in her coat pocket and filed at the small land office kept by a clerk named Elias Frome, 38 years old, in sleeve garters and spectacles, a homestead claim on the bend in the grazing land above it, the ground having reverted to the county's unclaimed rolls a full 19 years before, and never entered by anyone in the interval. Elias Frome asked no questions beyond what the law required, wrote out the paperwork in a careful clerk's hand, and told her, as he stamped the receipt, that a proving period stood between her and a clear patent, but that continuous residence and improvement, which she had plainly already begun, would satisfy it without difficulty. She paid the filing fee from Adeline Sharp's coin, and walked back up the trail with the receipt folded inside her father's old account book, beside the letter that had brought her there. The proving years passed the way seasons pass when a person has real work to fill them. She rebuilt the corral fence entire, restocked the tack room with new leather, bought a hide at a time as her own earnings allowed, and began taking in harness and saddle repair from freighters and ranchers through the valley. Working her father's round knife across the same kind of scarred bench Adeline Sharp had worn smooth before her. By the third autumn, riders from as far as the railhead were asking after Bracken Hollow work by name, and a freighter named Amos Trent, 31, who charged her half what he charged a stranger, because his own father had once bought his first good harness from Ezra Coy on credit in a hard year, and never forgotten it, hauled her finished orders down to the depot twice a season without ever once being asked twice. Word of what she had built reached Cornelius Coy in the county seat the way most valley news eventually reached the county seat. Slowly, second-hand, and stripped of anything but the bare facts that the niece he had pushed out of her father's shop was, it seemed, thriving on some abandoned ranch above Wolf Creek, filing homestead papers and taking saddle work 3 counties wide. He did not ride out to see it. His lawyer, Silas Meade, now 31 and somewhat grayer at the temple, mentioned once in passing, in a letter concerning an unrelated matter, that Mr. Coy's own share of the old shop's sale proceeds had gone quickly to old debts and a failed venture in freighting stock, and that the shop itself, sold to a buyer with no trade of his own, had changed hands twice more since, and now stood mostly shuttered, its old customers having long since taken their business elsewhere for want of anyone who could stitch a seam that held. Marguerite heard this from Zebulon Hart on one of his Sunday visits, delivered without malice, simply as news, and she found, turning it over in her mind that evening while she waxed a length of new thread, that she felt very little about it at all, the way a person feels very little about weather that has already passed. Cornelius Coy had believed, in contesting the will, that he was collecting what the law plainly owed him. He had not understood that he was handing his niece the one thing she needed most, which was a reason to cross further than anyone else was willing to cross. In the 5th spring, with the proving period satisfied, and the ranch producing a full season's work for the first time since Adeline Sharp's death, Elias Frome rode up the North Fork Trail himself, an unusual courtesy for a land office clerk, carrying the patent in a leather case, signed and sealed and stamped with the territorial seal. And he sat at the workbench Adeline Sharp had built and drank a cup of coffee while Marguerite finished a stitch line beside him and told her, in the plain, unhurried way of a man delivering good news he had waited a long time to deliver, that the ground was hers now beyond any question a court could raise, hers and no one else's, in a manner no interested witness and no uncle's paperwork could ever again disturb. She signed the receipt of delivery in the same steady hand that had once made a circuit judge's own clerk look twice, and Elias Frome rode back down the trail before dark, and Marguerite sat alone that evening on the barn step with the patent in her lap and watched the light go long and gold across ground that had, 5 years before, been nothing but a rusted chain and a collapsed house. It was on an evening very like that one, in the early autumn of the 6th year, with the season's last harness orders mostly finished and the first hard frost still a week or 2 off, that Tobias Reed rode up the trail later than his usual visits and later than the daylight, and found Marguerite on the barn step with a lantern already lit beside her, and he told her, without much preamble, in the same plain voice he had once used to describe a trick with neat's foot oil, that he had been offered a settled position managing a breeding operation 2 valleys south, a fixed thing, a house, and a proper barn of his own, and no more riding circuit from one ranch to the next, and that he had turned it down that very morning without regretting it for 1 hour since, because he had found, somewhere in 6 years of spring and autumn visits, that the only ground he wanted to keep coming back to was this one. He did not ask her anything that evening. He simply told her and let the telling sit between them, the way a new stitch line sits, waiting through a night, before anyone knows for certain whether it will hold under weight. Marguerite did not answer him that night either, not in words, but the following spring, when his gelding came up the North Fork Trail earlier than the season strictly called for. She was already standing at the corral gate to meet him before he was within hailing distance. And she did not pretend she had not been listening for the sound of him, and that, between two people who had spent 6 years speaking mostly through the careful language of harness leather and green horses and shared work at the same bench, was answer enough for either of them. By the 8th year, Bracken Hollow, as it was still called by everyone in the valley, though no one any longer thought of it as abandoned, supplied harness and saddle work to freighters and ranchers as far as the railhead, kept a standing account with Verity Nash's Mercantile and 2 others besides, and stood alongside a small horse gentling operation run from the rebuilt corral as the settled joint work of 2 people who had each spent a working lifetime learning that nothing worth keeping was ever simply given, and that a piece of leather, however raw at the start, could be worked patient and steady into something that held for a lifetime if it was never once forced. The old Coy shop down in Wolf Creek, sold and resold twice more since Cornelius Coy first let his share go, stood mostly shuttered now, its windows dusty, remembered by no one but Zebulon Hart, who mentioned it sometimes on his Sunday visits, the way a man mentions a fact of history rather than a wound. And Marguerite found she could hear the name Cornelius Coy now without any particular weight attaching to it at all, the way a person hears the name of a flood that swept through some other valley a long time ago and left nothing behind but a story. On a clear evening in the 9th autumn, Marguerite stood at the corral fence with a finished harness set over one arm and looked back at the barn with its true-hung doors and its rebuilt stalls, at the rebuilt chimney of the old house rising now above a new roof they had raised together the summer before, at the tack-room shelves, stocked deep with hides and finished work, at ground that had, 20 years before her, been kept alone by a widow who had asked for nothing in return, but that whoever found her letter be patient and kind and loved by someone who noticed a good day's work. She thought of her father teaching her to skive a piece of leather thin, and even without letting the blade skip. She thought of Adeline Sharp practicing the same cut 10,000 times alone on a bench worn pale with the marks of her own patience, trusting, in the last years of her life, that someone willing to cross far enough would deserve what waited on the other side. And she thought of Tobias Reed's gelding coming up the North Fork Trail each spring before the season strictly called for it. And she understood, standing there with the harness warm over her arm and the light going long and gold across the corral, that everything she had ever been given had come to her the same way a green horse comes to trust a patient hand, not all at once, and not without steady work, but one calm season at a time, never forced, and bound, in the end, to hold. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while I told it, take a moment now to subscribe and to share it with someone who has ever been handed a piece of paper that told them, without any real fault of their own, that a thing they built no longer belonged to them. Leave a word in the comments and let us know where you're watching from tonight. And tell us about the person in your own life who taught you to finish a piece of work as though your own name alone would answer for it. The one who showed you, in small and patient ways, that nothing worth keeping is ever simply given. It has to be worked and earned and proven, one steady stitch at a time. And ask yourself, too, before you close the window and go on with your evening, about the quieter question underneath that one, whether there is someone in your life who has kept coming back to you, season after season, without ever asking for more than the chance to help with whatever the next piece of work needed. Someone who waited, patient as a green horse, learning to trust a steady hand, for you to notice that he had already decided, a long time before, you had exactly which ground he meant to keep.